One thing that you have to look at when you talk about the development of cognition or of thinking is language and language development. And we know that with language development, it's extremely crucial that kids, people understand the importance of symbols in communication. And so, with that as kind of a starting point, let's take a look at language and how psychology looks at language and the importance of it. Of course, psychology loves to break things down, and so all languages uh, around the world contain basic parts. For example, phonemes. Phonemes are the smallest units of sound in a language. English has about 44 phonemes, okay, but it's the smallest amount of sound. For example, usually one or two letters, the letter A or the letter AH or E or M gives you certain letters when or certain sounds when you start to pronounce things, and those are the absolute most basic units in terms of language. Now, morphemes morphemes are the smallest unit of meaningful sound. So when you put together words like a or but or man, those type of words, those are words that they can be very short words, but you can't break them down anymore. The word but, you can't break that down any further to be meaningful. By the same thing, same token, the word man, you can't break that down anymore and come up with something meaningful. Ed would also be, or ing would be things that would go along, they would be morphemes as well. Now, it's kind of interesting because once we get into the development of language, well, then after a certain time period, yes, your vocabulary increases and all that, but very quickly you have to learn grammar and you have to be able to understand the complex meaning of different words in different orders and so forth. So, the rules of the language, that's what we mean by grammar. And syntax would be the order of words. Now, later in class, we're going to be discussing uh, the possibility of animals having language. And I will tell you right now, one of the biggest, most crucial pieces of that discussion that a lot of people bring up is whether or not animals have the ability or capacity to understand grammar. Yes, they can understand words. Yes, they can sometimes understand sentences, even complex sentences, but do they have the capacity for understanding and knowing grammar? That's one of the key elements that we're going to look at and that the experts look at when they try and figure out whether animals actually have the ability for language. Now, let's talk about language acquisition. Studies show that children in all societies go through the same sequence of learning the language. They have the same types of cries and babbles. Even deaf children will make the same sounds. So, this emphasizes kind of the biological influence on language. However, learning has also been proven to be extremely important in language development. So, you have to also include the importance of the environment. Now, in the studies, okay, we've learned that kids all over the world, around 4 months of age, begin what we call the babbling stage. Uh, it's a very difficult thing for an adult human being to actually even mimic the babbling stage. But little kids, if you've been around any little babies that around 4, 5, 6, 7 months of age, that's what they do. They just babble. It's kind of like they're trying to communicate, but they just don't know how. Around 12 months of age, that's when most kids start to say their first word, and usually it's just one word here, one word there. I was very happy when my oldest son I came in the room one day and he looked at me and I think I might have even been feeding him or something. And anyway, he looked up at me and he says, Dada, Dada. And that was his first word. And I was so excited that his first word was Dada. And then about an hour later, my wife walked in the room and he looked at her and he says, Dada, Dada. So then I knew we were in trouble. But anyway, it's that one word stage around 12 months of age. Around 24 months of age, we get to the telegraphic speech stage, and that's basically two words. So, for example, if the child wants something to drink out of the refrigerator, instead of looking at mom and saying, Mom, would you please get me some milk out of the fridge? The child will probably look up and say, Mommy, milk, or Mommy, drink. That's the two-word stage. They're still getting their point across, but they haven't quite learned all the stuff that goes with it. It's kind of interesting because after that two-word stage, kids get to the point where they start to overgeneralize. So they hear, or they don't hear things, but they say things like "mommy goed." Instead of "mommy went to the store," "mommy goed," "mommy goed." Those kind of things that they basically just overgeneralize the rules that they begin to hear. All right, let's go ahead. In language development, we also talk about critical periods. And remember, a critical period is a time period when something's most easily learned. We've talked about this in class before. For language, it tends to be around 2 to 12 years of age. That's the prime time for learning language. Which brings up the question, in American education, why do we tend to wait until most kids are in high school before we teach foreign language? And I think a lot of that is just simply the fact that in America we don't really we haven't put a huge emphasis on people knowing a second language. We believe everybody ought to know English, and that's good enough for us. So I think that's one of the reasons why. If we truly want people to be bilingual, we're going to have to begin teaching it at a very young age. Now, from about 6 on, most of our development actually comes in vocabulary because by that point in time, we at least have the basics of grammar and syntax down. Now, what happens if a child isn't able to learn language during that critical period? How does it affect it? And that is a case where occasionally we get children that fit into that pattern, then we can kind of find that out. Jeannie the Wild Child is a young girl that at age 13 back in 1970, authorities found her. She had been locked up by her parents in her household, in their house. And essentially, since she was a baby, she had been confined to one room in their house. She was punished anytime she made noise. She had never been taught how to talk or anything of that nature. So when people came in contact with her and authorities actually found that she existed, there was a lot of research done and a lot of intensive education going on trying to teach Jeannie how to speak. After years and years of intensive therapy, they finally got her up to about a third grade level of being able to speak and understand things. But her cognitive development and language development had been totally affected by the lack of being able to learn language during the critical period. Now, it's kind of interesting because again, when we learn language, doesn't matter if when we're a child, doesn't matter if it's English or Italian or Spanish or Chinese, it's all strange to us. So we basically go through the same patterns. Now, there's two big theories that people look at in terms of trying to figure out how we develop our ability for language. And one is the behaviorist theory or the social learning theory, same thing. of B.F. Skinner. And that basically says that language develops by reinforcement, imitation, and punishment. Okay? Children learn words and they're rewarded for saying them. Okay? But this theory does seem to have some shortcomings because, for example, it cannot account for children saying inaccurate words. For example, mommy goed. We talked about that a minute ago. The child doesn't hear that, so it's not like they're imitating it. You don't hear the word goad, so, or typically you don't. So this is one of those that I think Skinner would have trouble trying to explain. But that's the social learning theory: is that essentially it's a base, everything's based on reinforcement. Now, the other theory that is real prevalent and probably more liked by people around the world is the biological theory of Noam Chomsky. And Chomsky essentially believes that language is innate to humans. That children, again, children around the world develop language approximately the same way, at the same pace. He believes that humans share kind of an inherent universal grammar. Now, that doesn't mean that the grammar is exactly the same in every language, but the idea is that we're kind of pre programmed for that grammar. This theory is also supported by the concept of a critical period for language. And the idea that children who are not exposed to the language during that time find it very challenging to develop language. So, all of that information kind of goes along with this theory. And the whole idea here, the thing to remember about this is that Chomsky believes that we're kind of pre-wired for language, and that we have that universal language acquisition device, that switch in our brain that says, okay, we're ready to learn language. Okay, I think that's good enough anyway for the language section.